I'm going to continue the discussion that we've been having yesterday, focusing on, we've been talking about what I'm calling the building blocks of meditation. And yesterday was focusing on the concentration, the samadhi is the word, samadhi side. And I discussed a range of ways in which it's understood, some of the just most common basic ways, and a little bit about on the practice side. So today I'm going to focus on the insight side, and I want to spend some time talking about what do we mean by insight. It's understood in a few different ways, and then bring in some of the ways that as a practice, and this will be familiar to some of you, of how insight is taught and experienced and practiced. And then finally, we'll see, we may do this today or it may go into the talk tomorrow, just depends on time. I want to bring it all together and talk about paths of meditation. There's the path we call it the path of concentration. There's another path, we call it the path of insight. And then I don't have a single phrase that I've been able to come up with, but the way I practice and offer, where we bring them together as one path, if you will. So traditionally, insight, this is the word you may have heard in Pali, vipassana with a V, vipassana. By the way, if you ever hear it pronounced vipassana, that's just a Burmese accent. They pronounce the V's with a W. What they call, it's not a right or wrong, what we call International Standard Pali pronounces it as a V, vipassana. You'll hear it both ways. And I don't know if it's actually known exactly what the pronunciation was, 2,500 years ago. But so it's not like we call it international standard, nobody's right or wrong, but just that's where that comes from. And so this word vipassana, which translated as insight, and it's an interesting word because vipassana, the pasana, comes from this Pali word pasati, which means to see. And the prefix vi has the connotation of like penetrating into, and one Pali scholar once told me the meaning of the vi is it's like if there were a bunch of weeds growing and you wanted to see to the ground, you could put your hands in and pull the weeds apart so you could see all the way to the ground. So it's like that's the kind of idea. So it brings in a clarity of discernment, of penetrating into experience, of really being able to pull apart the weeds. So sometimes it's translated as to see clearly, would be a good translation. So that's this word vipassana, we translate as insight in. One of the traditional ways very common ways that you'll hear insight talked about is having insight into what are called, there's a list of 3 qualities called the 3 characteristics, or the 3 characteristics of all experience, or sometimes called the 3 characteristics of existence. So that's a pretty weighty, heavy-sounding phrase. And so let me just pause. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just to see what that is, hear what that is, because many of you have heard this, and it is one of the main ways that insight is understood and practiced. But I'm going to offer, I think there's a lot more to it than just 3 characteristics. But what the 3 characteristics are that us as human beings and all experience share these characteristics in common. You don't have to know the Pali at all, but I'll just say it. It's called anicca, dukkha, anatta. Those who've heard that. The anicca is impermanence. The dukkha is the word we've been translating as suffering. And anatta is this tricky word that we've been translating, that gets translated as no self. I want to say just a little bit about that, because some of it is you could think of Dharma practice or meditation as a practice of coming to know oneself. So then, and the question is, what's the nature of our own being? So what we mean by this impermanence, you would think there's not much we need to say about that. You know, it may seem like when we really get it, like it's not a surprise, right? Where all experience, nothing's going to last, right? Even the earth, the sun, the galaxy, uh, all of us, even black holes, actually, they say, given enough time due to quantum effects, will evaporate. So impermanence is built in. So we're going to lose everything. It's just built into the nature of things. And so the idea is that if you ask anyone, what is, are you aware that life is transitory and it doesn't last and nothing lasts and everything is lost eventually? Anybody would say, well, sure, of course. But how many people live their lives as if that's true? That's the trick. It's not just an intellectual understanding that we forget about. And so impermanence is an important, big, gets a lot of emphasis in Dharma as a place to emphasize and spend time reflecting on. Impermanence is funny because typically people hate impermanence when we're talking about things we love or want, but we love impermanence when it's some kind of pain or difficulty or, like I happen to have a fondness for impermanence when I reflect on, say, how long someone can hold presidential office in our country, for example. I have a lot of appreciation for impermanence there, for example. I'm just saying. So, so the idea is if we could really get it deeply and profoundly about impermanence, it's meant to lead to a letting go. This is what we were talking about, the liberation through non-clinging. What's there to hold on to? Because it's all changing, right? So there are two aspects to impermanence that we can have insight to. It's the way it's talked about in the source Pali text was things don't last. In later commentarial traditions, the emphasis was more on the fact of constant change. It's not only that things don't last, but everything's just in a state of flux all the time. So both of those ways of being with and looking at impermanence work. And you'll see for yourself, sometimes we're drawn in one way to view it or another. And so I'll come back. So a lot of the practices we'll talk about that are called insight practices are aimed to really intimately connect with this experience of change. So I'll come back to that when we talk about practices, but that's the idea of having insights into impermanence. Ostensibly, hopefully, it helps free our minds from grasping and clinging. So that's the first, impermanence. The second one, dukkha, we've been translated as suffering, but actually, it's a fine word. We all use it. I think I mentioned, I think it was yesterday, I said, they didn't ask my opinion, but I said I don't like the word concentration. I think it's got too many just connotations. And so, it's a setup for misunderstanding. Dukkha is kind of like that too. I wouldn't have picked that word, but but it's fine. But it actually comprises much more than suffering, because as a characteristic of all experience, even pleasure is dukkha. So what do we mean by that? I'll just pause briefly on that. Basically, if you go to the Pali Text Society Pali English Dictionary, it's all online now, but I have the old book, and it's first of all, it's a big 11 by 14-inch book, so it's really big, and it's a big thick book. The thing's huge, and it's 10-point font too, so they cram a lot on each page. And if you look up the definition of dukkha, it takes 2.5 or 3 pages to fully kind of tease out all the subtleties of meaning and the different ways it's used. If you go to the etymology of the word, it really has the sense, I think the meaning is something like the wheel of a cart, or that's out of round, or the axle's not perfectly balanced. So what do you get when you have, you're riding in a cart and one of the wheels is not, you get a bumpy ride is kind of the idea. So if I had to pick any one word for dukkha, suffering again is fine as long as we know what we mean, but I would pick unsatisfactory or unreliable. I think unreliable is a good word. And what I mean by that is we all know that suffering, pain it's not very satisfactory, and that is suffering. But even getting what you want is dukkha because of the first characteristic, impermanence. It's not going to last. And so the idea is if we store up or getting our happiness in having or not having any particular experience, it's a shaky, it's not a real refuge, if you will, like when we take the three refuges. It's an unreliable refuge because it doesn't matter what experience you have. It can, we don't deny that it will be satisfying in the moment. We say it's not ultimately going to do it for you. How many desires have you had and fulfilled in your life? Countless. But it doesn't take a lot, and it's okay in the moment, but then it doesn't take long before the next one pops up. It reminds me of when I drive a Prius. It's about 15 years old now, but I got this one, I think in 2005, gosh, 16 years old. But it was when the new ones were coming out. And I wasn't looking, I didn't need a new car. I was driving an older car, but my car was getting older. And so I gave my daughter's car, gave out on her. So I gave her my car and I was going to get a new car. It was due for it anyway. And I thought, okay, great. I'm going to get a Prius. All of a sudden I'm craving a Prius. I'm noticing them everywhere. I never noticed, I don't pay attention to cars now. And it was back then you had to be on a waiting list for 2 months. So I'm on the waiting list for 2 months. And I had this like wanting that was going, I was very uncomfortable, right? When I actually got the car, I mean, it was great. I still think I think they're good cars. I like it. I don't know if I'd get another one, but I could imagine. I've been super happy with it. But after the first day or two of, wow, I got this new, that kind of settles out pretty quick. And I just went right back to whatever, just my normal set point of happiness. I don't know what did I think was going to happen when I got the Prius. I was going to enter some glow of ecstatic, transcendent happiness or something, but the craving was there for it. The real relief I noticed was once I got the Prius, the mind just stopped craving after the dang thing. That was the relief, just to be free from the suffering of the craving. It was like, even though I didn't have any particular happiness with the Prius, I did appreciate, I try to appreciate just if I have a car, just the fact, but not getting into the whole environmental thing of it, but even how many people, they don't have a home, they don't have anything, they don't have a car. So I try to not take those things for granted, and we can have a whole discussion about, I don't take for granted even, I don't be careful not to get off the topic, but when I take my garbage out, I'm actually aware that I've got a house and a garbage can to go to. Seriously, you can start to bring in a lot of appreciation for things that we may not even notice. I never used to, when you turn on your faucet and water comes, that's clean water, safe, that's going to come out every time, as long as you want it, right? So I don't take these things for granted, right? A little side trip here on the Dharma Talk, right? We can start to really notice things that a lot of people, they don't, their utilities are cut off. There are, hundreds of millions, a billion people, something like, who don't have ready access to clean drinking water. And they have to walk, 2 miles to a well that's and it's not even safe water or whatever. So anyway, so I had a lot of appreciation for having the Prius, but I didn't have any happiness. But boy, what a relief when we let go of the clinging. So that was an idea of how dukkha can be suffering. There's something that's unreliable. Even getting what you want isn't ultimate if we're clinging. So it's fine to get what you want. I always used to give examples. Actually, someone on this retreat this happened last year, and I think their son or daughter owns a chocolate company. And last year, they did the same thing this year. They sent me these special, like these are really boutique chocolates. I mean, this is like as good as it gets. So I just got it like last week, my thing of chocolate, and I'm kind of got my stash. Don't want my wife to get it. This is my chocolate, right? Actually, we're all appreciating it here in the house. I'm just joking about that. But I enjoy dark chocolate. I'm not actually fishing for people to send me chocolates. I use it as a good example, but I have to be careful because I realize then people start thinking that and it's fine if you want to send me chocolate, believe me, I'll take it. But I enjoy it, but it's a great example because when I'm eating the chocolate, there's no suffering. I mean, good chocolate. I'm not talking about like those Trader Joe's 1-pounders. Don't buy that stuff. It's just not worth it. But it's kind of bitter and everything. But good dark chocolate, I appreciate it. And when it's gone, I just let it go and move on. That's a perfect example of we don't have to not have our experience, but it's the clinging, right, that creates our suffering. So that's the idea of dukkha. So we have the characteristic of impermanence. Second characteristic, dukkha, that all things are because of impermanence, even getting what you want is dukkha. And if we cling, it's the flavor of dukkha called suffering. That's the idea. And the third characteristic, I'll just say briefly here, is this, which is called no self or non-self or not self, is probably one of the most misunderstood terms in Buddhism. I'll just be brief on it. The idea there is that, again, it was an unfortunate translation. We owe a debt of gratitude to the British. It was part of British colonialism, people who were in India in the 17th and 18th centuries, and they were translators, and they rediscovered the Buddhist roots in India, and so the early British Pali translators, and they took this word anatta as no self. So let me just say what it really means. We're all stuck with saying self, but not self. It is not the meaning, though. People will say, they don't have a self. You all have a self. Nobody here doesn't have a self. Who do you think's listening to the talk? It's you. So what do we mean? What do we mean by no self? The word is anatta. You put an A in the beginning, it's a negation. So an atta. In Sanskrit, there's what's called an atman, and there's anatman, no atman, or no atta. Well, in the old Upanishads, in the tradition that in the yogic traditions in India at the time of the Buddha, there's this idea of Atman and Brahman. And the idea is Brahman is like, it's God, I guess. It's universal consciousness. And it's said to have three characteristics, which are called Sat Chit Ananda. Sat, existence itself, consciousness itself, bliss itself. So this Brahman is pure consciousness, pure bliss, pure existence itself. That's kind of the idea. And it's kind of like the ground of existence, if you will, is Brahman, right? And then we each have our individual soul, which is called the Atman. And then when you, according to the yogic traditions, when you really realize the truth, you realize that the individual Atman is merged with, it's not separate from the Brahman, and there's this Atman-Brahman union or something like that's the basic idea. I know that was kind of quick, but so Atman is your eternal soul. Anatman is no soul. In Pali, that's anatta. It's not no self, it's no Atman. That's what it is. It's saying you have no Atman, no permanent soul. That's actually not even accurate, though. It shouldn't be understood that way. It shouldn't be taken as an ontological truth statement of whether you actually have a soul or not. It's more from a practice point of view to liberate your mind. It's saying whether you've got a soul or not, forget that. If you have some belief about it, what is it that you can know and see and experience? It's everything about you in the ordinary sense as a human being, your mind, your body, and all that's, it's not and the Atman Brahman are eternal and unchanging. Well, anything you can get your hands on and wrap your mind around is changing in the nature of your own being. So when they say no Atman, no self, a more accurate way to think of it is, yes, you have a self, but what's the nature of yourself? And the idea is that it's seen, this is one of the insights, to be a collection of changing processes. There's no Richard in here to whom all this is happening. Everything that makes up the nature of my being, including the consciousness, is just it's a conscious flow of a river of being, if you will, a river of experience, a river of consciousness. So our whole being is this impersonal changing flow that arises due to causes and conditions, right? So I know that was quick. We could hang out with it. Maybe it'll come up in the questions. I'm happy to do one-on-one interview if you want to explore it more. But I realize that's necessarily too fast. And I know I was kind of rushing through just for time. Well, but the idea is, where does so much of our suffering comes? Clinging, well, just pick the body, clinging to the body. Clinging to the body is not a reliable strategy for attaining happiness. And some of you have heard this story. I'll make it quick. When I got my new driver's license, which just, I went in, got my photo and had my driver's license. Here in California, you renew your license every 5 years. So I got to do it by mail. I didn't have to go in and take another photo. And so, pay the money, and new one comes. 5 years later, same thing, got to do it by mail. It was only the third 5 years, so it had been 15 years. I had to go in and get a new photo. So I go in and get my photo. And all these years I'm looking at my driver's license. Yep, that's me. And then the new one comes in 15 years later, pull out the old one, pull out the new one. Who's that old guy? I look in the mirror, I see some old guy looking back at me. It's like, what happened to my youth? What went wrong? I used to have hair and it wasn't white, right? This is what we're talking about. Nothing went wrong. It's just what happens, right? If I'm clinging to my youth, this is the clinging that comes from not seeing the nature of the self, then it's a setup for suffering. If I can rest in harmony with the way life is, including the aging of the body, then it's a path to letting go and having more peace with the way things are. That's the idea of these three characteristics of having insights into them. Okay, so just the basics on that. So I want to come back from a practice point of view, but that's one way insights can happen that can help us when we really reflect on these things, maybe experientially, through our meditation, even experience it even more intimately. But I would go further than those three characteristics. I would say an insight is anything that we understand, experience, perceive, come to know, realize that is in service of our own liberation. So, for example, you can have psychological insights, right? And this can happen, it can happen in any part of life, sometimes in psychotherapy, sometimes just through living. Certainly in Dharma practice, one of the things that can happen is that if there are places in us that need some healing maybe, or that have wounded places or challenging psychological places, those things can reveal themselves. Sometimes they've been hidden. And what can happen is they can kind of self-liberate in a way. Sometimes you don't have an insight into them, just through the samadhi, they kind of heal up. But having insights into them, we could really get perceptions about some of the patterns, the way we work, that maybe we hadn't realized. I'll just give you a quick example. One of the things that's happens quite commonly is people will come to meditation interviews and will will say that every time they try to pay attention to their breath, they notice that they're kind of tensing up or tightening up. They can't relax and they're kind of controlling the breath, and they hadn't realized it until they sat with it and was present with it and tried to work with it. And they had never noticed that before. And then the more they're with it, they realize there's something going on. They're not able to let go around the breath. It's just kind of a pattern in there. And sometimes you'll work with a person like that and they'll hang out with it, and maybe uh, you don't have to have these psychological things at all. Some people don't have any of this psychological stuff. I'm just giving examples of what can happen. And then all of a sudden there's a realization there, and you'll ask them, well, hang out. I'll ask, well, is it okay with you if I'm not a psychotherapist, but I'll say, how about if we hang out with this? Well, if they say yes, it's like, okay, so why don't you just bring your mindfulness there? Where do you feel it? Well, I feel my breathing in the belly. Okay, why don't you just put your attention there? We'll just hang out. What do you notice? Oh, I notice tension or tightness. Okay, stay with that. Do you happen to notice any feelings with that? You may or may not. And sometimes it's happened. People will say, yeah, I have some anxiety there, I think I realize. And going through like this, it can unpack itself, and people can realize, maybe I've had it happen where someone realizes that they hadn't noticed, but they tend to go through life with kind of a background coloring to their perception that's sort of like life isn't safe, and they're kind of got a vigilance maybe, or I don't know, hypervigilance is a strong word, and they're, life who knows, maybe it led to some memories from childhood when life really wasn't safe, and on like this. I'm just saying that would be an example of psychological, we'd call it a psychological insight, but it's still a liberation insight. There were patterns there that were not leading to liberation and freedom, but were leading to taking certain stances in relationship to life, feeling protected, having to feel protected, right? And where it's kind of a clinging. Sometimes people will say, well, in Western psychology, there's this idea of having a healthy sense of self. And how does that fit in with no self in Buddhism? And there's really no conflict, because what does it mean to have a healthy sense of self? Let's just say if you have maybe what we might call an unhealthy sense of self. I'm sorry, I'm just not that articulate. That's probably not the best way to say it. But hopefully you just know where I'm getting at. Unhealthy sense of self. Those are actually places where, whether we're aware of them or not, where we actually have a very strong identity, but it may be a very negative one, or one that creates a lot of suffering. And it might be a lot of clinging and just attachment to that identity. And when we heal up those processes in us, that kind of creating these negative identities that we believe and live out of kind of liberate. We don't have to create this new self called a healthy sense of self. We can just liberate the places and heal up the places that don't serve us well. We call it the unwholesome. And then just let ourselves be more. We don't have to make it into anything. We can just kind of be more. So that's kind of the idea of how you can get insights like that. So this is a big, big, big topic, but anytime you realize anything about how you perceive things, how you're living, sometimes it's just really, if you use the Four Noble Truths model, that might be a way of, right, suffering, the cause of suffering, the ending, and the way to come to ending. We start to filter our experience through that model. And we're starting to pay attention when there's suffering, to really look and say, well, what's going on in my mind? What's causing the suffering? And that'd be kind of doing an insight kind of work, right? You're really looking to see suffering and its causes, and to gain more understanding in service of letting go. So that's kind of the idea of all these insights that we can have. It's just ways of becoming more aware, right? There's much, much more I could say in the realm of insight. It's just like in the world of samadhi, it's big, but that's kind of gets the idea of what we mean by having insights. So there's different ways that you can do insight as a practice. right? And so you might go on a meditation retreat, say, at places that are insight meditation centers, and perhaps get instructions, work with your breath, but there are different models where you might be guided to purposely put your attention. That's the meditation practice itself. They may not put emphasis on one object like the breath to deepen concentration. They may just, like, one way that insight meditation is taught is you might stay with the breath for a few days, but they'll say you just don't put your attention on any objects. They'll say it like this: you just stay present moment to moment as various experiences come and go, arise and pass away in your experience, and the mindfulness is just there. Some people relate to that way of thinking about it and articulating it. Some people, they don't relate to that. But the idea is that everything's changing, so you don't give any preference to the breath. Maybe it's like there's a few breaths, then maybe a backache, then a sound, back to the breath, maybe now a knee ache, itch, worry in the mind, back to some breaths. And it's just the flow of so many things going on in the mind and body. And that's a way that you could practice as an insight meditation. You're just bringing mindfulness to see that these experiences are just changing. That's one way it can be taught as a practice. Another way it can be taught is consciously putting your attention to specifically look for one of the characteristics. So you could stay with your breathing, for example, and make a point to notice that the experience is changing. You're looking for that quality. So if you stay with your breath at your nose, right, you could do the experiment. You can notice that the air is kind of there's a pause. You're noticing that, and then it changes. It's going, the air builds, coming in the nose. Maybe it's cool. You get more of a full inhale, and then it kind of pauses. Then you notice there's an exhale, and it starts to come through. Maybe you notice it's not cool like it came in. It was more from the body. It's a warmer air going out. That would be an example of paying attention to the fact that it's changing. You could do that as an insight practice. You're looking to deepen your awareness of change on purpose. So I've already mentioned kind of two flavors here. One was just, you're not looking for change, but we're just staying mindful moment to moment with what's coming and going in your experience. And on its own, the idea is that you'll get it more deeply, that it's all changing. And then the second I mentioned, you're actually looking for change, trying to, again, get it somehow really deeply in the mind. And so it's some in service of non-clinging. Wow, everything's really changing. But it's not a concept, it's really experiential. And you could pick any experience. If you're dealing with anything in the body, knee pain, backache, you can just be with it, and you just put your mindfulness there and just mindful of it. That falls into the category of insight practices. Or you can actually look to see, is it changing? Is it pulsing? Does it get stronger, weaker, and everything? So that's a practice. Put it on emotions, sounds, thoughts, anything. Similarly with dukkha, that's a whole thing of practices there. So you could, look for using the Four Noble Truths model that I mentioned, and just noticing. It's not so much about the content of of your experience, but how you're relating with it. And if there's some contraction or clinging around it, we actually can notice that on purpose. And we notice the suffering. It's kind of like I used that Prius example, but that was a great example. I was very aware of the suffering that was coming through, like craving the Prius. And I knew ahead of time, as soon as I get it, I was just going to go back to normal. I didn't, but the feeling was there. So you can feel the suffering, the dukkha that comes through craving and clinging. That would be an insight kind of practice. The same thing about self. There's all these practices to look directly into the nature of your own being. And I'm not going to get into them here, but there's a few models. I'll just name them, and we just don't have time on this retreat. But one of them you may have heard is what's called the 5 aggregates model. The word in Pali is khandhas, Khandhas, just means aggregates or heaps. And it's just a way of deconstructing our experience of our mind and body into sections. And I don't want to go into it, but it's like even looking at the mind, there's different things going on in the mind. There's the consciousness itself. There's all the thoughts going on. There's moods and emotions. There's a lot of things in the body. And the exact 5 ways they break it up isn't important for here. Let me know and I can tell you the list, or just do a web search on 5 aggregates Pali Buddhism or something, and it'll pop up. But it's just a way of deconstructing. And then you can watch, pay attention to your experience in terms of that, and you see that it's all just changing. It's a way to help us connect into the sense that it's all changed. There's nothing to cling to, right? So that's an example of a way to look specifically at not self, and there's other models also. So you can see that you can do kinds of meditation called insight meditation, right? So a couple more things, and then I want to say a little bit about, we've talked about, well, let me just say what I'm going to say. If you go back to the way I was speaking yesterday about concentration, I did not talk about the liberation coming from insights. I particularly didn't use that language. Matter of fact, I even said one of the ways that the liberation can come is as we go into samadhi. You may not even be thinking in terms of traditional insights in your practice. And there were 2 things I said. One is there's something called, if you recall, for those on the talk, there was called purification of mind. There is a rewiring of neural patternings that can happen so that things tend to naturally be more settled out, a lot of our reactive patterns. And you won't, if in that way, you're not conscious of any insight happening. It's just a function of the samadhi kind of ripening or marinating us or cooking us, right? And then another way that the liberation can happen ostensibly is, again, you may not be thinking about insights, but it's just out of the samadhi, the balance, the steadiness, the equanimity carries through, and we're living in a way that's naturally less reactive and not clinging, and more just a sense of knowing and being, and not grasping and clinging. So there's ways that liberation happens where you're not even thinking in terms of insights. And then the way that I'm speaking of it today, the idea is having the insights as a practice. There's many more ways, but I named a few ways you could practice it, because you actually are specifically looking to see some of these characteristics or psychological insights. And that's meant to sort of disentangle some of these conditioned patterns, so then you're less reactive. And I will say that it's just clear to me that all of these ways are good, and will work in various combinations for all of us. Yeah. So why would it be that some meditation teachers think if you're doing concentration meditation, you're not doing insight meditation, and vice versa? Well, remember yesterday I was talking about 2 basic ways that concentration samadhi can unfold. One is I call inclusive, and one I call exclusive. Do you remember that? Or one-pointed versus unification of mind. And I said if you got really concentrated in the exclusive one-pointedness, you'd get so one-pointed in your focus that you actually lose awareness of other experiences. You'd actually disconnect from the experience of change. You wouldn't feel your body anymore. Maybe if you saw light and bliss, there would just be only a field of light and bliss, for example. And it wouldn't experience a change. It'd be kind of a fixed thing. Well, if you think that the way to liberation is insight into change. And if you believe that that when we talk about concentration, we're talking about this exclusive concentration where you lose connection with change, then it's natural that you're going to feel like doing concentration is cutting off any possibility of insight because you don't have access to the change you're trying to have these deep insights into. And in fact, in the traditional texts, it talks about if you want to practice in that kind of insight, you want to get a certain amount of concentration, but you don't want to take it very far because you want to be some amount of undistracted and steady. But you don't want to go so far that you lose connection with change. So you can stay there and do the insight work. So you can see how, understandably, some teachers say insight and concentration aren't the same thing. However, if you practice in a way in which your samadhi is inclusive samadhi, the mind becomes profoundly clear and present and undistracted, just like in the other kind. But you not only have not lost connection with change, it's enhanced. Remember, I used that example of the mind becoming like an electron microscope or Hubble telescope. You perceive more than ever. In that way, concentration not only supports insight, but it's not separated from it. That's really the idea when we try to bring it together in the way I'm talking about here. We want to take the concentration as far as we wish, as far as we can, developing the inclusive kind. And then we get the best of both, right? You get all the purification of mind that happens in the samadhi. You get all the equanimity that comes out of the steadiness of having a concentrated mind. And you know the feeling of that, right? When you've been more concentrated on retreats or whenever, and that steadiness carries with you in between the formal meditations, right? And it opens up more powerfully on the insight side of the practice too, because when other things do come up, it's not just the purification of mind that I was talking about, but you're just seeing more, either the three characteristics or maybe psychological insights or whatever. It's actually more powerful because you're less distracted. You're really in it. And so it's a way in which naturally they all come together. Right? So that's another flavor. So as you move forward, you can get exposed to many, many kinds of meditation. And the more you get exposed, hopefully it can be confusing because you have so many teachers. One teacher over here saying, here's how you practice. Listen, I'm telling you, this is it. And everybody's saying that person's an enlightened master. You got to do what they say. Okay, great. Then you get some other enlightened master over here. And they're saying, no, don't listen to that person. That's just wrong. You got to do this. And it goes on and on. Not everybody's that bad, but it can be. And it can be confusing. But I find it kind of liberating when we realize the beauty of having so many styles of practice is because the fact that we're all different and there actually is no right or wrong. Not trying to be sort of politically, dharmically correct, but it's literally true. And so the only thing that matters is as far as I can tell, people seem to have come to profound depths of realization and liberation, practicing in all these different ways. So I think that's really good news. So we've talked about the building blocks of meditation, right? Samadhi, the concentration, mindfulness, insight, and the heart qualities. So I want to pull this together now. I think I've already kind of said it, but I just bookmark these three Dharma talks, the ending. Now I want to talk about the three main elements in the meditation family. Concentration meditation, insight meditation, and this blended integrated style. If anybody can come up with a single phrase, you should let me know. One person said one Dharma, but I think someone's already grabbed that. So I've got to come with something better. All right. So let's just say you decide you're going to do something called insight meditation, right? In any of these different ways. that I was talked about, or many, many other ways it could be talked about, you're going to want to put some amount of emphasis on the concentration part just to help steady your mind. So your mind's not just jumping and lost all over the place. So you're already bringing some of the concentration in, right? So you can't really separate out the concentration and the insight. And mindfulness also is sometimes equated with insight, and that's fine, but the mindfulness is through everything. So if you want to practice in that way and just articulate it or frame it as doing insight meditation, it's up to you how much you want to particularly emphasize the strengthening of the concentration aspect, regardless of how you are practicing. And then perhaps consciously shift to some of these others, like particularly looking for change and other things. But what I want to point out to you to pay attention to in even on this retreat or at any time, notice for yourself, because most people will find that the more concentrated you are, it's not that you're disconnected from yourself. You're actually, as I said earlier, you've enhanced connection with yourself. And so you don't have to worry about getting too concentrated. Teachers may say it, but look to your own experience. It doesn't matter what I or anyone else says. And you answer for yourself, is doing this concentration disconnected me or enhancing connection? Most people naturally are going towards a kind of meditation that's the inclusive. The more concentrated you are, you're more aware of everything. You might not have a lot of experience going on because everything's settled out because you're so concentrated. But if you check, you still have a sense of the body being there, the mind, whatever. So if you want to do insight, do any of the practices, see for yourself how much the concentration side will support you. And go back, stay with the breath a lot or shift, whatever. But you just stay attuned to how it is for you and what supports you the best. If you want to do a kind of practice called concentration practice, and you're not thinking of insight, you're just, okay, I'm going to do concentration meditation. And it doesn't matter what the technique is. Mindfulness of breathing, mantra. You can, sometimes people stare at visual objects and to kind of, it's like working what they call kasinas. There's all these practices. Body scans, there's so many kinds of meditation practices. I can't list them all here. You can stay with that and take it as far as you want, whatever's working for you. And you know that you'll see for yourself that even if you're not thinking in terms of insight, you're going to need to learn to work with your suffering along the way. You have to bring in the mindfulness. You have to bring in, that's the insight side, coming to know the ways that you create struggle, the way you get contracted and don't have ease and relaxation, aren't able to go deeper because you're tied up in a knot. You're on right there with the insight, right? So what I'm trying to say is I feel that whichever way you articulate it is fine. I'm going to go do insight meditation. I'm going to do concentration meditation. But in fact, you can't really separate mindfulness, concentration, and insight. They all come in. It's just a question of either on their own, they grow in different emphasis, or you choose to emphasize one over the other more, but they'll all will come in. So you can't really go wrong, right? And so then again, the way that, and this goes back to what I said on the opening night, the intro session to the retreat. Now we can come back and sort of re-articulate it and hopefully have a good sense of it. The way I'm encouraging or offering, I'm not actually encouraging anything because I want to support what works best for each person. But what I'm offering to experiment with is you find a method or a technique that helps you. You just stay with that and really give yourself over to it. Not like bearing down and getting tight and tense, but just kind of a wholeheartedness with it. And let it take the concentration as far as it will go. And really, it's as simple as that. And there's only two other pieces then. You'll notice that on its own, regardless of whether you intend it or not, there will be plenty of times when you won't be able to concentrate, or you'll be mad or worried, or your body's going to be hurting, or your psychology comes roaring up, or just your neighbor's bothering you because you're trying to meditate and they won't stop chopping wood next door. Whatever it is, it can happen. All this other stuff is up to deal with. You didn't choose to be on the insight side of the practice. It chose you, and you're there now. And you need to be able to work with these things. If you can just let them go and be in the background and just stay with your breath, that's fine. But you will have times where you can't do it. And you need to be able to then be present and work with these things. Whether working with it means just be mindful of it, whether it means looking for the 3 characteristics, whether it means doing something we call investigation. That's a big topic. But basically, it can be a verbal thinking through. We don't want to dismiss the place of actually thinking things through. We don't want to overdo it, but we don't want to throw that away. That can serve us sometimes. But we want to be able to just sort of feel more deeply in. It's kind of like the example I gave when someone was controlling the breath. That was an investigation, but it was like a nonverbal feeling into the belly. Oh, they noticed there's some tightness. Oh, they noticed there's some kind of suffering or unsafety. Oh, they had memories of childhood. That's an investigation right there, an example that was a nonverbal kind. So that's a big topic on what we mean by investigation, but all these different ways we work with all these things that come up, we're doing the insight work. And then it's going to settle out at some point. Sometimes it feels like it's not going to settle out if it's been going on for days. So we have to be patient. And I've been through things like that before, so I know how that can be. But generally, we have these ups and downs, and at some point, you're going to be able to concentrate again. You're back on the concentration side. Just go with that. And so what our task is in this integrated, we'll have to think, I appreciate someone just sent, maybe call it integrated Dharma. So, okay, that's a nice term. Well, maybe we'll have to kind of hang out with that. Or integrated meditation, I don't know. Rather than choosing anything, all we're really doing, the bottom line to all of this, is we're learning how to, by training the mind, we're becoming more and more finely attuned to knowing what's happening moment by moment, right? Sometimes, if we haven't trained our mind, we're trying to pay attention to our minds, but we don't know, we're not trained. But what am I supposed to look at? I don't know. But as the mind settles more and we get more experience, we're more naturally aware of what's happening. It's the natural unfolding. And then we use that to let it inform what's needed and stay attuned and just let the present moment tell us what's most skillful and needed. And in this way, we let go of our own agenda. And we kind of flow back and forth between the concentration and insight. It's an artificial way of speaking, but just as a way of speaking about it, between the concentration side and the insight sides of the practice, where it feels like we're emphasizing one or the other. And we just continually flowing and moving back and forth. Again, we end up kind of getting all of it. This is not a better way to practice than any other way. It's just a particular way that's consciously naming it as bringing them together as one path. Different qualities, but we're bringing them as one path, right? Again, I will say this, when I was, I started meditating when I was 18, no, I was actually 17 years old. And didn't know anything, but I was real naive, super idealistic. And in those early years, I kind of threw myself into this stuff. When I knew the least, I was the most opinionated about how it is and the right way and what's wrong. And it was just I can remember back, it was so clear in my mind. This is the right way to meditate. Those other ways, yeah, no, but that's not really the real stuff. I was so much that my path has always been mindfulness of breathing, and my foundational has been connecting at the area of my nose. Now it's, over the years, as many of you know, it transcends those methods, but I still, connect with breathing. but boy, I thought you got to do mindfulness of breathing, and you got to feel here, because that's a sharper, clear object. If you put your attention in your torso or your belly, it's too mushy, you won't get concentrated. Well, that was how it was for me. I didn't realize that there's the huge world of people out there. It's just the opposite. If they tried to connect here, it would be counterproductive. And it really took a lot of years kind of on its own, where I came to honestly appreciate the diversity of paths and practices. Yeah. And I think the only mistake people make is by saying, their way is the only way or the best way. And that's okay. I mean, I'm not going to quibble if somebody wants to say that. And we can go try out with those people and see how it fits. Yeah. But in this way, we give ourselves a lot of permission, even permission to head in a path that ends up not to have served us that well. I don't want to say screw it up, but maybe that's how it feels, right? And just mess up. Because what we have to realize, not just in our meditation practice, but in all of life, we're all going to fall flat on our face 1,000 more times. So, get used to it, my friends. This is part of being a human being. But if we hold ourselves with kindness, it's not falling flat on ourselves. It's like we learn, and we just we're all doing the best we can, right? And by the way, every one of us are doing the best we can. I don't know if you realize that. Just to end, I'll offer this. Sometimes when people say, no, I'm not really doing the best I could. You don't realize I'm too lazy. No. If you could do it better, you would. So I'll offer it like this. It's kind of like a joke where you say, I've got good news and bad news. So first, the bad news is you're doing the best you can. It looks like this. And the good news is you're doing the best you can. It looks like this. You feel the difference? And so it doesn't matter how we judge what we're doing. We just are all making our best choices, informed by our sincere intentions. And it's just a wonderful thing about how the universe seems to work, but I think it's enough. I'll share this last thing. My son is I have a 13-year-old son. He's a jazz trombone player, started playing when he was 8, and he's into it. And actually, I just realized the trombone's in I meant to take that out. You see, it's in the frame of the picture. That's I meant to take that out before the retreat started. I forgot. But that trombone, so he can play pretty good. I mean, and he can improvise, and he's in these jazz bands and stuff like that. So I was trying to learn to play the trombone a little bit. I'm not going to really learn. It's just like, I haven't practiced at all. I can barely, if you try to play a brass instrument and you haven't done it, it's hard to even make one note. It's hard. And when I tried just like a few months ago, I remember back when he was first starting, and I mean, he couldn't blow. It just sounded like, a dying elephant or something. It was just, he couldn't get a decent sound out. And he stuck with it and kept practicing. And on its own, he didn't have to have any skill or ability. He could just be terrible. And just that was good enough. And just in the doing, it naturally grew. And now he's actually got some pretty good skill. He sounds great. He went up to this all-state jazz band and up there, and they sounded good. It's like that in anything, and it's like that in our meditation. I hate to say you don't have to be any good at it, because that's not right. But just to make the point, you can feel like, I don't know how to do this. I don't have any skill. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what Shankman's talking about, any of this. But it's not a teacher. It's not me. It's not a book. It's like with you in the doing, in the process with yourself of engaging and just bringing whatever you have. And if you doubt this, I'll be happy to talk with you one-on-one. Everyone regardless of the situation in your body and in your mind. Bringing what you have is enough. And that will then, in the same way like the playing the trombone, it will grow. And what used to be impossible now becomes second nature for us. So I hope that feels liberating to you, knowing that we just make our best choices and then just look to see what happens. And that's all you have to do. So I hope that's useful. That kind of wraps up this sort of 3-part Dharma talks on this. And again, please let me know in the chat, send me emails if you need to discuss any of this more. I'm happy to. We can slow it down. That was a lot to pack into just 3 talks, but hopefully you got just an overall sense. And then starting tomorrow, I might shift gears a little bit on what we're doing. So thank you very much. Why don't we sit quietly for a few breaths, and then I'll ring a bell to end. Okay.